Pre- and post-World War II Latinx riots in the U.S. During World War II, there were increased tensions between Anglo and minority Americans for numerous reasons. One, the increase in immigration from Latin American countries and the obsessive wave of patriotism that was going through all of the United States, mainly because people were rationing both food and clothing as part of the war effort. There were also new groups of people entering the workforce, including women and minorities. Unfortunately, tensions increased and led to many violent outbursts. And many of the veterans who returned from the war had returned hoping that people of color would be experiencing less discrimination. Unfortunately, that was not the case. The Zoot Suit riots in California were one such result of the increased tensions. The Zoot Suit was a style of clothing that became popular with African and Mexican Americans. It required using extra cloth to make them appear larger and baggy. Unfortunately, this style was seen as unpatriotic because they should have been rationing their cloth rather than using extra for their suits. This led to riots breaking out between Mexican Americans and Anglo servicemen coming from the local bases. The damage was extensive, with some of the servicemen going into Mexican neighborhoods and destroying homes and property in large gangs. There's some evidence that higher up military officers at the military bases allowed for the riots to happen because all of the servicemen were granted leave. Around the same time, in Puerto Rico, similar riots were breaking out between the nationalist group that was fighting for independence and the insular government and police who were sent to Puerto Rico. This photo here is of Pedro Albizu Campos, who was a Harvard-educated man, and he was the leader of the nationalist group in Puerto Rico. Tensions had been rising in Puerto Rico since the 1920s, mainly for economical reasons, because the large U.S. corporations that were operating in Puerto Rico were purposely keeping the locals in poverty by paying them very little. New laws were enacted that included banning the speaking of Spanish in all schools, forcing children to learn English. The Puerto Rican flag was banned, and anyone found with one could be subject to up to 10 years in prison. Because the economy rested so heavily on crops like sugarcane and coffee, it was subject to severe depressions. And in 1937, in the city of Ponce, during a peaceful protest of young nationalists protesting the U.S. rule and harsh laws, was brutally attacked by the insular police in what is now known as the Ponce Massacre of 1937. There is even evidence that afterwards the police rearranged the bodies of the victims to make it appear as if the protesters had started the riot. This was all part of the U.S.'s strict control on what information left the island to mainland media. Then, in October 30th, 1950, the tensions had finally reached its ultimate boiling point when the Nationalist Party led a huge violent outbreak in 9 towns across the entire island against the insular police and government. They were led by their leader, Pedro Albizu Campos, who had originally planned it for November 3rd, the same day that the elected governor was to approve a new constitution that would continue Puerto Rico's dependency on the U.S. Unfortunately, they realized they had a spy within their nationalist organization, and so they decided to attack instead on October 30th. The insurrection lasted for multiple days and required the National Guard being sent in to end the revolt. Hundreds were arrested and at least 28 were killed. Very little information about the insurrection made it to mainland media, and those that did only described it as a small violent outbreak between Puerto Ricans. There are definitely some major differences between the two riots, the Zoot Suit riots in California and the independence riot / insurrection of Puerto Rico. For one, the nationalists were fighting for independence from from the U.S., where the riots in California were over who was more American, and that Zoot Suits symbolized something that was un-American. The other major difference being that media had much more access to information about what was happening and able to spread it to other cities across the country than Puerto Rico was able to. However, the similarities included that both riots were racially motivated, had only occurred after years of tension building, and had included the use of servicemen. This is a timeline of the important events, with the Ponce Massacre occurring in 1937, the first attacks by white sailors in California against Mexican neighborhoods in Oakland in 1942, the official start of the Zoot Suit riots in 1943, the passing of the gag order, or otherwise known as the Law 53, that banned the use of Spanish and the Puerto Rican flag. 1950 was the planned island-wide insurrection, and it wasn't until 1954 when 4 Puerto Rican nationalists opened fire inside the House of Representatives in Washington as an attempt to continue the fight for independence.